Okay, so in our literacy lesson today, what we're looking at is the use of effective openers. That's the way that we start our sentences. And the reason that we're working on this is so that we can vary our sentences and use different clauses or different sentence lengths, and also so we can engage the reader. So we're going to have a look at how openers, the beginning of our sentences, can make our story more or less interesting, depending on what ones we use and how we use them. You're going to need your whiteboard and pen or pencil and paper to do this, so if you don't have that at the moment, pause the video, go and get them, and then come back and be ready to take part. So we're going to start off with this text that we have here. I'm going to read it to you, and you'll see that it's linked to our topic for this week. I got to Mars. It was really dry there. I got out of the spaceship and walked around the planet. I thought it was amazing to see such a different world. I was so lucky to be there. I got back into the space rocket and returned to Earth. Now, when you have a look at this story, you'll see that I have used some punctuation, I've got some interesting vocabulary in there, but one of the things I haven't really done is that I haven't varied my openers for sentences. So if you have a look, you'll see that each sentence begins, this first sentence begins with the word I. The next sentence begins with the word it. The next sentence begins with I, and then I, and again I, and even again I. So this is an example of a piece of writing, and quite often it's the kind of writing that we see from some primary sevens, where you get into your story and you completely forget about openers, and then when you look back and see that every sentence begins with I or it or the, and that's one of the things that makes this piece of writing not as good a piece of writing as it could be. So if we have a look going further on to see how could we make a difference to that. So have a look here and you'll see the red writing is where I've added openers. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, an opener could be just one word, and I've added lots and lots of words. Sometimes openers can be phrases. Sometimes you need a whole phrase, a group of words, to make the opener of the sentence more interesting. So let's listen to this and find out the difference that these openers make. After a long and dangerous voyage, I got to Mars. Looking out from my cramped rocket, I could see it was really dry there. Slowly and carefully, I got out of the spaceship and walked around the planet. As I explored, I thought it was amazing to see such a different world. Gratefully, I realised I was so lucky to be there. Exhausted, I got back into my space rocket and returned to Earth. Now, you'll notice a great difference between this and the previous slide, which had pretty much the same story, but nowhere near as interesting to read. So the phrases here that I have used are showing all different sorts of ways of opening the sentences. And by using these various openers, I've not only used openers, but I've also included more interesting vocabulary. Some of you will also notice that I've greatly improved my use of punctuation, because these phrases that I'm using as openers require the use of a comma as well. So by just thinking about openers, all of a sudden I've improved my writing in 3 of the VCOP ways of vocabulary and openers and punctuation. And that's what I'm hoping will be the difference in your writing once you've finished watching this and able to try testing it out on your own. So let's have a look at the types of openers that we might use. One of the ways of using an opener, instead of just saying I or it or the, is to think about putting things in order. So we might say, first this happened, next I did such and such, then something different happened after that. So this is one of the earliest ways that we learn to use openers. You'll remember further down the school being encouraged to start stories or start sentences with these kind of openers, and they're still perfectly good openers for you to use. also another way of using timed openers if we start with every day or on Tuesdays or last week, or there are many different examples. These examples here are just to give you some kind of idea. You'll be able to think of some of your own that will be timed openers, which will tell you when something happened. Another type of opener which you've been using sometimes in school is to use adverbs. That's these words that end with ly usually. So we might say suddenly something happened, or noisily the space rocket took off from Earth, or calmly I looked around to see what I could explore. So adverbs are a very good way of beginning your sentences as well. So as well as time or adverbs, at the place that something might be happening could be a way that we start our sentence. So I might say, across the sky I could see a huge array of stars, or all around me was nothing but silence. So we can use the place at the beginning of the sentence instead of, sometimes we might use it at the end of the sentence. You might say, I could see stars all around the sky. But instead, if we say all around the sky, comma, I could see stars, that helps. It's one of the ways that we can vary or mix up our sentences to just make it a bit more interesting. As well as all of these, the other way of using openers is to use ing or ed words, words like stunned. So I'll give you an example of that. You might say, stunned, I looked more closely at the alien which had appeared. So stunned and then a comma. Stunned, I looked more closely. Or we might say, grinning widely, comma, I realised that I was the first human ever to have stood on this spot. So you're starting a sentence by saying what you're doing, so that's grinning, and then you give the reason why. You could otherwise have written the sentence, I realised I'm the first human to stand there, so I was grinning. But instead we're changing the sentence around just to give a bit of variety. So all of these are different ways to open our sentences. They're all ways that you'll come across in books that you read, or in stories, in sentences. So now let's have a look. Another way of doing it is to have connectives. Now you'll remember further down the school that you were told you couldn't start a sentence with connectives. But now you're getting better at being able to understand how to use the clauses of sentences, so you are able to do it. You might start with, although the sun was setting, comma, the planet still felt very warm. Or you might say, because my oxygen was running low, comma, I was incredibly worried about whether I would survive. So you're starting with the connective. Instead of putting it in the middle of the sentence, you're putting it at the beginning of the sentence, but you still need to have the other phrase that makes it make sense. So we're going to practice using these openers, because that's an awful lot of things that you've listened to and an awful lot of examples that we've shown. So in the top right hand corner here, you'll see the different types of openers that I've talked about with some examples. There are obviously other ones that you can use, but here are some examples to get you started. And I've put here, remember to use a capital letter. I haven't put a capital letter in mine because they're not actually in the sentences, but all your sentences will have to start with a capital letter. So you're going to choose an opener from the list to put at the beginning of these sentences at the bottom of the page. So I could have a sentence that says, I emerged from my spacecraft. But instead of that, I'd like you to make it more interesting. So you might say, last week I emerged from my spacecraft. Or, although I felt afraid, I emerged from my spacecraft. So you'll see that I'm choosing to use one or other of the openers that are in the box, and I'm putting it before the rest of the sentence to make a longer, more interesting sentence. You might need a comma depending on which opener you're using. So for a challenge, what you can do as well is try using different ones of the openers like I just did with that first example, and see, oh, some of them might work and some of them might not work. They might not make sense, or they might change the meaning of the sentence completely depending which opener you use. So you're going to press pause on the video and you're going to write down on your whiteboard all of these sentences at the bottom of the page, choosing one of the openers from the box to start it off with. Once you've done that, take a picture of that because that's something that you're going to submit. Now, hopefully you've managed to complete that and you've got the sentences written down. These are great openers for when you're writing stories. But on the next slide, we're going to have a little look at some other openers which you might use not so much in story writing, but in more functional writing, like, for example, if you were writing a report. So because a report has a different kind of language and it's more formal than a story, it might use different kind of openers. You might use some of the ones from the previous slide, but here are some others. In conclusion, which means the bit that you're writing at the end, or you might start with clearly or usually. You might start with in addition, however, it is thought. I'll give you an example of that. You might say, it is thought that there can be no life on Mars because of the lack of water. Here's another interesting one. You see the one that's got if ... then. So an example of how to use that is, if you have a sentence which is working like this, then you might be able to use if and then together. We might have, if you want to find out more about Mars, then you can use the internet to do some research. So that's what if then means. It means that you're putting if at the beginning of the sentence, but you're continuing the sentence using then as a connective to have two parts to your sentence. If this, then something else. So just as with the previous slide, I'm now going to get you to pause the video and use some of these openers from the top box to put in front of the sentences at the bottom of the page to make interesting factual sentences. So it's a little bit different than the previous one, because it's not the same sort of language as you would use in story writing. So on you go and write these sentences with the openers. So if you have that finished, you can also take a picture of that, which can be submitted as your work from this task. Now, let's just finish off with checking again what our success criteria was. So we're looking to use effective openers to vary your sentences and to engage the reader. So far what you've done is you've looked at examples of different openers. You now should be very clear about what an opener is, that it's the word or the phrase that you use to start a sentence. Depending which opener you use, that allows you to vary your sentences, so that sometimes it's one word and it's going to be a short sentence. Sometimes it's a phrase where you're going to need a comma to break the sentence into different phrases. Sometimes using one opener will give it an entirely different meaning than if you use a different opener. And so that's how you're varying your sentences. But also by using a variety of openers, so not using the same one every time. Do you know that kind of habit that you might have of writing a story and every sentence begins with then this happened, then this happened, then that happened? That's not going to engage the reader. But if you use a variety of openers, if you use different ones every time, then that will be more interesting for the person reading your text. So I've put the different types of openers and the ones that you might need in functional writing. And in addition to that, I have put this triangle, which gives at the very tip the openers that you first used when you were beginning to write sentences in primary one for the, my and I. And then as you go further down the pyramid, it's giving a wider example, it's giving more examples of openers that you can use. The very bottom one says that you can open with a wide range of sentence openers to keep the reader interested, and that means any of the ones in the pyramid any of the ones from the rest of the slide. So the additional challenge for you, if you have taken a photo of the previous 2 pieces of work that you've done, an additional challenge is for you to write at least 5 sentences of your own now, using any ones of the openers that you can see on this slide. There's a huge variety of them in the 2 different boxes and the pyramid. Use at least 5 different ones to write 5 different sentences. Remember that the sentences are going to have to start with a capital letter. Remember as well that you may need to use a comma between the phrases. Now, I know that that's challenging and that some people will know how to do that and other people are not yet at that stage, and that's absolutely fine, because what we're focusing on is to use the great openers. The extra challenge is to do the commas if you're able to do that. Okay, so pause the video here, but keep it up so that you can see these different openers, and then you can write your 5 sentences and then submit them to me. But most importantly, over the rest of this week, keep trying to use openers like these, because it's not only in writing that we start sentences, we also start sentences when we're talking. The more that you can use these in your speech, the better you'll be at being able to use them in your writing. Later on this week, we are going to do some story writing based around the topic of Mars, and so I'm hoping that the more practice you put in with this, the better your writing will be, and actually the easier it will be for you to use it in your writing. Okay, thank you very much.